Your home is your sanctuary, the one place you feel safe. But what happens when 100 tons of aluminum falls from the clouds? We are looking back at the terrifying moments when major airliners crashed not into mountains or oceans, but into cities just like yours. From the tragic collision over Brooklyn to the devastation in São Paulo and the miracle on the Hudson's banks. This is not about shock value, it's about history, memory, and the lessons learned at a terrible cost. If you're looking for a serious documentary, welcome to the channel. Let's explore the 9 times airliners crashed into cities. It is the evening of October 4th, 1992 at Amsterdam Schiphol. El Al Flight 1862, a cargo run from New York to Tel Aviv via Amsterdam, is getting ready for its last leg of the journey. The airplane is a Boeing 747 freighter, heavy with cargo but carrying only a handful of people, 3 pilots and 1 non-revenue passenger. From the cockpit, this looks like a straightforward departure. Weather is reasonable, visibility is good, and the crew are experienced. They brief the standard climb out, set the power, and line up on the runway that points them straight out over the flat suburbs of Amsterdam Zuidoost. The jumbo accelerates, lifts off, and starts climbing to the east. Lights of the city slide under the nose. In the cabin, there is no passenger chatter, no meal service. It is just a working cargo jet heading out on another overnight leg. Then, not long after takeoff, something happens that no one in that cockpit has ever trained for. On the right wing, the number 3 engine pylon fails. The engine doesn't just quit, it physically tears away from the wing. As it breaks off, it slams into the engine next to it, ripping that one loose as well. Both heavy engines and their pylons separate from the wing and fall away, striking the leading edge and tearing through fuel lines, control systems, and the structure of the wing itself. From the ground, witnesses see a strange sight, a climbing 747 trailing smoke and debris from one side, clearly missing engines. From the cockpit, the view is very different. The engines hang under the wing, not where the pilots can easily see them. The main clues are instruments and vibration. They know they have lost thrust on the right. They know something serious has happened, but they cannot see the huge physical gap in the wing. The crew declare an emergency and ask to return to Schiphol. They start turning back, trying to stabilize the jet. With 2 engines gone on one side and a damaged wing, keeping the aircraft under control is extremely demanding. There are warnings about systems that have failed, changes in handling, and fuel imbalances building as damaged tanks leak. Still, for a time, the jumbo keeps flying. Controllers vector the flight back toward the airport. In the cockpit, the crew are fighting physics on several fronts at once. Asymmetric thrust, structural damage, and degraded lift on the right wing, where slats and flaps have been destroyed. The airplane is now far from the clean, symmetric machine it was designed to be. Every degree of bank and every knot of airspeed matters. As they line up for the emergency approach, the margins finally disappear. Because of the damage, the right wing cannot produce the same lift as the left, especially at the lower speeds needed for landing. As the crew slow and configure for approach, the jet edges closer to the point where that damaged wing can no longer carry its share of the weight. The bank angle creeps up, the nose begins to drop. The pilots try to correct, but the combination of lost engines, broken systems, and destroyed high-lift devices leaves them almost no room to recover. Over the Bijlmer district, a densely populated area of high-rise apartment blocks, the aircraft makes its final fatal move. The right wing drops, the bank angle increases, and the huge freighter rolls toward a near-vertical attitude. Residents on the ground look up and see the impossible. A 747 turning on its side, descending directly toward their homes. There is no time to escape. Flight 1862 slams into the corner of 2 connected apartment buildings, Groningen and Klein-Kreutberg. The impact tears a vertical wound through the structure, ripping out a whole section of apartments and sending fire, fuel, and debris deep into the complex. The upper floors collapse into the gap. A fireball climbs into the evening sky over Amsterdam Zuidoost. Inside the buildings, people who had been cooking dinner, watching TV, or putting children to bed are suddenly caught in an explosion they never saw coming. Many die instantly. Others are trapped behind fire and rubble. Emergency services race to the scene, but the combination of structural collapse, fire, and the height of the buildings makes rescue extremely difficult. Everyone on board the aircraft is killed. Dozens of residents on the ground also lose their lives. Officially, the death toll is in the 40s, but for years there are questions about whether undocumented residents might raise the real number higher. For the city, it is simply de Bijlmer, the Bijlmer disaster. Investigators later piece together the chain of events. They find that the engine pylons on the right wing failed due to metal fatigue in critical attachment points, allowing the engines to separate under load. When they broke away, they destroyed systems the pilots depended on and turned a manageable engine failure into a deep structural and aerodynamic crisis. The crew, unable to see the missing section of wing and fighting a damaged aircraft, tried to bring it back, but physics and altitude were against them. On the morning of December 16, 1960, New York City was sitting under low winter cloud, with light rain and leftover snow on the ground. Above that weather, two airliners were converging from different directions, both cleared into the busy airspace that feeds New York's airports. One of them was United Airlines Flight 826, a brand new Douglas DC-8 jet. It was coming in from Chicago to Idlewild Airport, which we now know as John F. Kennedy International. On board were 77 passengers and 7 crew, flying in on one of the most modern jets in the world at the time. The other was TransAsia Airlines Flight 266, coming from Ohio toward LaGuardia. 39 passengers and 5 crew sat under its curved ceiling and triple tail. It was an old propeller-driven design, but still a workhorse of domestic travel. New York's skies in those days were managed with radio beacons and intersections drawn on paper charts. United 826 had already reported that one of its navigation receivers was not working properly, which made it harder to identify an important waypoint called Preston, a fix where the jet was supposed to slow down and enter a holding pattern. Air traffic control was not told about that equipment issue. Controllers shortened the route and cleared the jet toward Preston, expecting it to slow to normal holding speed before reaching the intersection. Instead, the DC-8 stayed fast. As it descended through cloud toward the city, the jet was still doing around 300 knots and had already gone past its clearance limit. The crew never checked in with controllers to say they had reached the fix. Below them, the Super Constellation was descending on its own path toward LaGuardia, lined up with a different approach, also in cloud and light rain. The two airplanes were about to occupy the same piece of sky without seeing each other. At 10:28 in the morning, over New York Harbor, one of the right engines of the United jet sliced into the TWA Constellation just ahead of the wings. In a fraction of a second, the propeller aircraft was torn open. The Lockheed broke apart and fell in pieces toward Staten Island, shedding debris as it spiraled down. It crashed onto the edge of Miller Field, a former military airfield, sending wreckage into the grass and the nearby water. The DC-8 was badly damaged, missing part of its wing and an engine, but it did not fall straight away. For around 90 seconds, it remained in the air, wounded, descending over the city with power still on the remaining engines. In the neighborhoods below, there was no warning, no alarms, just the ordinary noise of a Brooklyn morning. Then the jet came out of the clouds over Park Slope. Witnesses saw the big airliner low over the brownstone rooftops, trailing smoke and debris. A moment later, it slammed into the intersection of 7th Avenue and Sterling Place. The impact blew apart 10 apartment buildings, a church, a funeral home, small shops, and a delicatessen. Fire spread through the block. 6 people on the ground were killed. Residents thought at first that a boiler had exploded or a bomb had gone off. Only when they stepped outside did they see pieces of an airliner in the street. On the TWA flight, everyone died on impact. In Park Slope, rescuers found one survivor from the United jet, 11-year-old Stephen Baltz, who had been thrown into a snowbank and was still alive when neighbors reached him. He told them he had seen New York's lights from the window before the crash. Despite doctors' efforts, he died the next day from burns and inhalation injuries. In total, 134 people lost their lives. It became the deadliest aviation accident in history up to that time and remains the worst crash in United's history. Investigators later concluded that United Flight 826 had flown past its holding fix at too high a speed and outside its cleared airspace, descending into the path of the TWA Constellation. Navigation issues, high workload, poor speed management, and the limits of the air traffic system in 1960 all played a role. Out of the wreckage came changes, better reporting of faulty navigation equipment, new rules on speed near busy airports, and improvements in how controllers hand off and separate traffic. For New Yorkers, though, this accident is remembered less as a list of regulations and more as the day two airliners met in the clouds and fell into the city itself. A jet in the middle of a Brooklyn block, a propeller airliner in a Staten Island field, fire in the streets, snow turning black, and a reminder that in the early jet age, the skies over big cities were still being learned the hard way. It is the evening of July 17, 2007, in São Paulo. TAM Airlines Flight 3054 is on its final leg, arriving at Congonhas Airport from Porto Alegre. The airplane is an Airbus A320, a familiar red and white jet in Brazil's skies, carrying business travelers, families, and commuters into the heart of the country's largest city. Congonhas is not a remote airport surrounded by fields. It sits inside the city. Apartment blocks, offices, and busy avenues press right up against the perimeter fence. On a clear day, people in nearby buildings can look down and see jets flaring just above the rooftops. That evening, the weather is bad. It has been raining hard, and the runway surface is very wet. Pilots across Brazil know that Congonhas has short runways, and at that time, drainage and grooving issues that can make stopping distances tight in heavy rain. The approach into the airport is routine, but there is not much room for error once the wheels touch down. There is another complication on flight. One of the thrust reversers on the Airbus is out of service, which is legal if certain procedures are followed. The right engine's reverser is deactivated. Company instructions and checklists require that when they land in this condition, the thrust lever for that engine must be brought all the way back to idle at touchdown and left there. Only the other engine should be used for reverse thrust. As the jet lines up for its approach, the crew brief the landing. They know the runway is wet. They know they have one reverser out. They are aware that braking performance could be critical. The passengers, as always, hear none of this. They see rain on the windows, city lights below, and the cabin lights dimmed for landing. The Airbus descends over the buildings of São Paulo and crosses the threshold of the runway at Congonhas. It touches down on runway 35 left, the main arrival runway, pointing uphill toward the city. For a few seconds, everything looks normal. The spoilers deploy, the wheels are on the ground, and the airplane should now be slowing down on a very wet strip of concrete. But in the cockpit, a small but decisive error has already been made. Instead of bringing both thrust levers back to idle and then selecting reverse only on the good side, one lever is pulled back while the other remains forward in the climb or go around position. That means that on one side of the airplane the engine is producing power, not braking. On a dry, long runway, this might still be survivable. On a wet, short runway in the middle of a city, it is a recipe for disaster. From the outside, the jet appears to touch down and then keep moving much faster than it should. The wheels begin to spray water. Inside the cockpit, the crew realize that the airplane is not slowing as expected. They select reverse, push the brakes, but the conflicting thrust setting on the right side means that the deceleration is far below what they need. The aircraft hydroplanes and skids, struggling for grip on the wet surface. The end of the runway is coming quickly. There is no long, flat safety area. Beyond the pavement lies a busy avenue, an embankment, and TAM's own office and cargo building. As the pilots fight the situation, the jet veers slightly left, cannot stop, and runs off the far end of the runway at high speed. It crosses over the road, hitting vehicles and the embankment, then slams into the TAM Express building and a nearby fuel facility. For people in the neighborhood, it looks and sounds like an explosion in the middle of the city. Flames erupt from the building. Thick black smoke rises above the surrounding streets. Fire trucks and ambulances from both the airport and the city rush to the scene, but the impact and fire are overwhelming. There are no survivors on the aircraft. People inside the building and on the ground are also killed. In total, nearly 200 lives are lost, making it the deadliest air disaster in Brazil's history. Data from the flight recorders confirms that after touchdown, one thrust lever was pulled back while the other stayed in a forward power setting. That created asymmetric thrust and seriously reduced braking effect. Investigators also focus on the cockpit workload, the clarity of procedures for landings with one reverser inoperative, and how the thrust lever position was displayed and monitored. At the same time, they look at the runway itself. Tests and prior reports had already raised concerns about water drainage and the lack of proper grooves on the Congonhas surface. A very wet, almost flooded runway reduces friction dramatically and increases stopping distances. Combining a marginal runway with a misconfigured thrust setup turned a demanding landing into a nearly impossible one. In the final analysis, TAM Flight 3054 is not blamed on a single cause. It is the result of a chain of factors: an inner-city airport with short, wet runways, a high-speed landing, a thrust lever left in the wrong position for a deactivated reverser, and procedures and oversight that did not catch the risk in time. On the morning of February 4, 2015, TransAsia Airways Flight 235 lined up for departure at Taipei's downtown Songshan Airport. The flight was a short hop to Kinmen, a routine regional service flown by a twin-engine turboprop, an ATR-72. In the cabin were commuters, families, and tourists settling in for a flight of less than an hour. Outside, the weather was overcast, but not extreme. Visibility was good enough to see the city and the river below. Nothing about the scene suggested that dozens of dashcams were about to record one of the most disturbing images in modern aviation. The turboprop accelerated and lifted off, climbing out over the dense urban sprawl of Taipei. The airplane began a shallow right turn, following the departure path that bends around buildings and roads toward open terrain. For a short time, everything looked normal on the instruments. Then, just after takeoff, a warning appeared for the right engine. In the cockpit, the crew suddenly had to deal with an engine problem at low altitude, over a city with little time or margin. On a twin turboprop, a loss of thrust on one side creates yaw and roll that the crew must counter while diagnosing which engine is actually failing. The checklist and training are built around a simple principle: identify the correct side, secure the problem engine, and keep the working one producing power. In the stress of those first seconds, that logic began to break down. Cockpit recordings later showed confusion about which engine was at fault. Power levers were moved, switches were changed, and one engine was brought toward idle and then shut down. The critical mistake was that the engine that was fully shut off was the one still capable of producing power. From that moment, the airplane was in serious trouble. With one engine effectively lost and the other not producing enough thrust, the ATR's speed began to decay. Stall warnings and stick shaker activation started to go off, warning that the wings were running out of lift. The airplane was low, over built-up areas, with very little altitude to trade for speed. Instead of lowering the nose and letting the airplane accelerate, pitch and bank inputs continued, and the angle of attack stayed too high. The turboprop slipped closer to a full aerodynamic stall. On the dashcam videos that many viewers have seen, this is the moment when the ATR suddenly appears in frame, banking hard left over a busy, elevated highway. The airplane is already deeply rolled, left wing dropping toward the road below. Drivers who had no idea a plane was in trouble suddenly see a white fuselage and spinning propellers fill their windshield. The left wing clips a taxi and the side of the bridge, tearing the wing apart. Miraculously, the taxi's occupants survive with injuries. The ATR, now fatally damaged, rolls further and slams into the Keelung River beside the road. Rescue crews and bystanders rush to the riverbank. The fuselage had broken and partially submerged, with pieces of wing, tail, and cabin structure scattered across the water. Some passengers managed to escape from the wreckage and were pulled onto rescue boats in the riverbank. Many others never made it out. In total, 43 of the 58 people on board died, along with widespread shock across Taiwan and the global aviation community. For people watching the news that day, the most unforgettable image was that frozen dashcam frame. An airliner turned almost on its side, skimming past high-rise buildings and a highway, seconds before impact. Investigators later pieced together the sequence from the flight recorders. There had been a problem with one engine, but the primary reason the airplane was lost was the crew's response. The working engine was mistakenly shut down, leaving the ATR without enough power at a critical moment. Stall warnings were not handled according to training, instead of a clean, drilled response to pitch down, power, wings level. The cockpit was full of conflicting actions and comments as the situation unraveled in seconds. On the morning of September 25, 1978, San Diego woke up to clear blue skies. It was the kind of Southern California day when jets slide in over the city all the time and no one even looks up. Pacific Southwest Airlines, Flight 182 was one of those jets. A Boeing 727 on the last leg from Los Angeles to San Diego, full of commuters and vacationers, lined up to land at the single runway of Lindbergh Field. The approach path runs right over the city, past houses, schools, and small streets in the North Park area. At the same time, a small Cessna was flying a training flight in the same general airspace. Air traffic control was running both aircraft under visual rules. The crew of the jet were asked to keep the smaller plane in sight. At one point, they reported that they had the Cessna, then that they thought it had passed beneath them. In the cockpit, they were busy descending, configuring, and turning on to final. From that high jet cockpit, it is easy to lose a tiny white airplane against the clutter of rooftops and haze. The Boeing turned onto its final approach, descending through a bright morning sky over the city. Passengers could see houses and streets coming into view as the jet lined up for landing. Nothing about those last moments felt unusual to anyone in the cabin. Then, in an instant, routine ended. As the 727 descended, its flight path crossed that of the Cessna. The larger jet's right wing sliced into the smaller aircraft. The Cessna disintegrated. The airliner itself suffered catastrophic damage to the wing and fuel system. Fuel erupted into flame. The jet rolled, pitched, and began to fall. Over North Park, people on the ground heard a loud bang and looked up. What they saw became one of the most famous aviation photographs in history. The big PSA jet was in a steep, nose-down attitude, smoke pouring from it, clearly no longer under control and heading straight for the neighborhood. There was no long glide, no controlled attempt to reach an open area. In a matter of seconds, Flight 182 plunged into the residential streets below. It hit houses, cars, and trees, tearing through a block of the neighborhood and erupting in a massive fireball. Dozens of homes were destroyed or badly damaged. Everyone on both aircraft died, along with people on the ground. The aftermath was chaos in a very ordinary place. Firefighters and police worked their way through burning houses, tangled wreckage, and fallen power lines. Residents who had been making breakfast or getting ready for work suddenly found their street filled with twisted metal and black smoke. The idea that a jet could drop out of a clear blue sky into a suburban block became a terrifying reality. Investigators focused on how two aircraft could end up in the same place at the same time in clear weather. They examined radar tapes, radio recordings, and procedures. They looked at how visual separation had been handled, how traffic advisories were given, and how easy it actually was for a jet crew to lose sight of a much smaller aircraft below and ahead of them. The accident raised hard questions about mixing fast, heavy jets with small training planes in crowded terminal airspace, and relying only on eyes and radios to keep them apart. In the years that followed, procedures and technology changed. Radar coverage, altitude assignments, and separation rules were tightened. Traffic alert and collision avoidance systems, which warned pilots of conflicting traffic independent of air traffic control, became standard equipment on large airliners. The idea was simple. Never again leave safety entirely to "we think we see him" over a major city. For San Diego, PSA Flight 182 is still remembered as the morning when a falling jet turned a quiet neighborhood into a disaster zone. For aviation, it is one of the defining cases of what can happen when airliners and small planes share the same sky over a city, and one moment of lost visual contact is all it takes. On the night of February 12, 2009, Colgan Air Flight 3407 left Newark for Buffalo as a short regional hop. It was a Bombardier Q400 turboprop painted in Continental Connection colors, with 49 people on board and a route that thousands of commuters had flown before. Outside, it was a typical upstate New York winter night, dark, cold, with light snow and cloud around Buffalo. The flight itself seemed uneventful. The de-icing system was switched on shortly after departure, and along the way, both pilots talked about the ice building up on the wings and windshield. The autopilot stayed in charge for most of the cruise and descent, quietly trimming and adjusting. In the cabin, passengers felt only the usual bumps of a winter flight and the gentle sense of slowing as the airplane descended toward Buffalo Niagara International Airport. Near Buffalo, approach control cleared them for an instrument landing on runway 23. The gear came down, flaps were set, and the speed began to bleed off. The Q400 was flying through icing conditions, but not beyond what the airplane was certified to handle. The critical factor was not the ice itself, but how close the crew let the airspeed drift toward the low-speed Q, while the autopilot hid some of the changing feel of the airplane. As the turboprop approached the outer marker, the captain called for more flaps. The speed kept dropping. When it fell far enough, the stall warning system woke up. The control column shook violently as the stick shaker announced that the wing was at the edge of an aerodynamic stall. This was the moment all their training should have prepared them for. Lower the nose, add full power, reduce the angle of attack, and let the wing fly again, even if that meant losing some altitude. Instead, the captain reacted the wrong way. Startled by the sudden shaking, he pulled back on the control column, trying to raise the nose. That increased the angle of attack and pushed the wing deeper into stall territory. The first officer, also under stress, retracted the flaps without coordination, which reduced lift at exactly the worst time. The stall protection system then tried to help, pushing the nose down, but the captain overrode it and continued to pull. The airplane pitched up steeply, then snapped into a rolling nose-down descent. Over the quiet suburb of Clarence Center, only a few miles from the runway, people were at home for the night. At 10:17 p.m., residents heard a roar and a crash as Flight 3407 dropped straight into a house on Long Street. The impact and fire destroyed the home and the airplane. Everyone on board was killed, along with one person inside the house. 2 other occupants of the home escaped with injuries, and neighboring houses were damaged by debris and fire. The National Transportation Safety Board later concluded that the core cause of the crash was the pilot's inappropriate response to the stall warning. They had allowed the speed to decay, were distracted by non-essential conversation during a critical phase of flight, and then reacted in a way that went directly against their training when the stick shaker activated. Fatigue, workload, and the way regional pilots were trained and scheduled all came under scrutiny. For the families, the story did not end with the report. They pushed lawmakers to change the rules for regional airlines, from minimum experience requirements to rest regulations and training standards. The result was a major overhaul of how smaller carriers in the United States operate. For viewers, Colgan Air Flight 3407 is the image of a commuter flight that never reached the city lights ahead, but instead fell into a single house in a quiet neighborhood. For regulators, it became the turning point that forced the system to treat regional airline safety as seriously as that of the big names painted on the side of the jets. On the morning of January 16, 2017, Manus Airport near Bishkek was wrapped in thick, freezing fog. Turkish Airlines Flight 6491, operated by ACT Airlines for Turkish cargo, was nearing the end of a long overnight run from Hong Kong to Istanbul, with a planned fuel stop in Kyrgyzstan. The airplane was a Boeing 747 freighter, heavy with cargo but carrying only 4 people on board: the captain, the first officer, a loadmaster, and a cargo handler. From the cockpit, the approach into Manus was already stressful before they ever saw the fog. The terrain around Bishkek is ringed by mountains, so arrivals have to respect strict minimum altitudes and step-down points. The instrument landing system for runway 26 is the lifeline that guides jets safely down through cloud and fog, but to use it correctly, the crew first have to be in the right place and at the right height. On Flight 6491, that profile started to get away from them. As they came toward the airport, the crew repeatedly pushed for lower altitudes, frustrated that air traffic control was keeping them high because of the mountains. Clearances eventually came, but the airplane was still too high and too fast for a calm, stable approach. The jumbo was pointed down at a steep rate of descent, speed building, air brakes in and out, racing to get from high cruise altitudes down to where the approach should begin. By the time they reached the waypoint that should have put them at 6,000 feet, they were still about 3,000 feet higher than the published altitude. Instead of leveling off and resetting the approach, they pressed on. They continued descending, trying to capture the signal from the instrument landing system that would guide them down to runway 26 through the fog. For a while, the airplane's receivers could not pick up the proper glide slope. The ground proximity system called out glide slope warnings, indicating that something about their vertical path was not right. Those oral alerts came and went as they tried to make sense of the instruments. Outside the windows, there was nothing but white and gray. No runway, no lights, no horizon. Then, at about 3,400 feet, the autopilot finally locked onto a glide signal. The crew believed they had captured the correct path, and the captain armed the automatic landing mode. The nose lowered into a controlled descent, and the big freighter started following what the system thought was the electronic slope to the runway. In reality, the airplane was not on the proper glide path at all. The investigation later found that the autopilot had likely captured a false or spurious glide slope above the real one. In simple terms, the airplane was following the wrong invisible line in the sky. The crew, already tired and under pressure to get in, trusted what they saw on the instruments more than the uncomfortable feeling that the approach had been unstable from the start. As they descended into the fog, the ground proximity system again warned about the glide slope. The minimum decision altitude was coming up, the point where, in poor visibility, the crew either must see the runway environment or abandon the landing and go around. They strained to pick out the runway lights through the fog. Nothing appeared. They passed decision heights still effectively blind. Only then did the captain finally call for a go-around. Thrust began to increase and the nose started to rise, but by this point, they were already far too low and not where they thought they were. Instead of being over the runway, the jumbo jet was still short and slightly offset, aligned with a residential area just beyond the airport perimeter. Out of the fog, a line of trees suddenly appeared. The right wingtip sliced into the treetops. Moments later, the landing gear and engines smashed through the outer fence of the airfield and then into the houses of the village of Dachasu. The aircraft briefly bounced, broke apart and rolled as it plowed through homes, finally exploding in a massive fireball that lit up the winter fog and engulfed dozens of buildings. There were no survivors on the airplane. Dozens of people on the ground, many still in their beds in the early morning darkness, were killed when a cargo jet tore straight through their village. In total, 39 lives were lost, making it one of the worst air disasters in Kyrgyzstan's history. The investigation later described a chain of human and technical factors, a crew that allowed itself to be dragged into a steep, unstable approach, repeated pressure to get lower and land despite the terrain and fog, failure to respect published altitudes and procedures, and reliance on an instrument signal that was not the correct glide slope for the runway. The ground warning calls about the glide path were not acted on in time, and the go-around decision came only seconds before impact. On the morning of November 12, 2001, New York was still living in the shadow of the attacks on the World Trade Center. Just 2 months had passed. Skies were clear over Queens as American Airlines Flight 587 taxied out at John F. Kennedy International Airport, heading for Santo Domingo. The airplane was a wide-body Airbus A300 with every seat taken. Most of the passengers part of the tight Dominican community that moves back and forth between New York and the Caribbean. The flight rolled toward runway 31, left behind a Japan Airlines Boeing 747. Controllers warned the crew about possible wake turbulence from the heavy jet departing ahead. That warning mattered. When a large airplane takes off, it leaves behind swirling air in its wake, a pair of invisible rotating tubes of air that can rock the airplane that follows. 587 lined up, advanced power, and started its own takeoff. The big Airbus accelerated past the terminal buildings, lifted off, and began climbing out over Jamaica Bay. Inside the cabin, it felt like any other departure from New York. Passengers felt the usual push into their seats, then the lightness as the airplane left the runway and started banking gently to follow the departure route. At first, everything looked normal in the cockpit as well. The first officer was flying, the captain was handling the radios, and the airplane began a climbing left turn as cleared. Then, as they climbed through a low altitude, the jet began to feel the disturbed air left behind by the 747. Small jolts and yaw movements showed that they had entered wake turbulence. On a modern airliner, some bumps from wake are expected, and usually handled with small, smooth corrections. On this flight, the reaction was very different. The first officer began making large rudder inputs to counter the motion, pushing the pedal one way, then the other, quickly and aggressively. The Airbus responded with strong side-to-side movement, and each rudder input made the loads on the tail grow. The rudder and the large vertical fin that carries it are designed to cope with a full deflection in one direction, even at high speed. What they are not meant to withstand is full deflection one way, then full deflection the other way, back and forth in rapid succession. That kind of alternating load multiplies the stress. In just a few seconds, the forces on the vertical tail went far beyond what the structure was built to handle. Out over Jamaica Bay, those forces finally won. The composite lugs that attached the Airbus's vertical stabilizer to the fuselage failed. The entire tail fin, with the rudder still attached, tore off the airplane and fell into the water below. In the cockpit, control forces changed instantly. The jet yawed violently without its stabilizing tail, then began to roll and pitch in ways that were impossible to control. The pilots struggled to understand what was happening. With the stabilizer gone, the airflow around the wings and engines changed drastically. As the airplane departed controlled flight and entered a spinning descent, the aerodynamic loads ripped both engines from their pylons. Each engine separated and fell into the neighborhoods below, crashing into streets and houses blocks away, tearing up a gas station and damaging homes. The fuselage itself continued on, descending over the Rockaway Peninsula. At 9:16 in the morning, the airplane slammed into the residential Bell Harbor neighborhood, at the intersection of Newport Avenue and Beach 131st Street. The impact and post-crash fire destroyed houses and scattered wreckage across the block. All 260 people on board were killed, along with 5 people on the ground. For New Yorkers, the first reaction was fear that another attack had taken place. Large buildings were evacuated, bridges and tunnels were briefly closed, fighter jets took to the air. But as investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board began to reconstruct the flight, a different picture emerged. There was no bomb, no intruder in the cockpit, no external sabotage. The evidence pointed to the tail, the rudder, and the way the airplane had been flown. Data from the flight recorders showed the sequence clearly. The Airbus encountered wake turbulence from the Japan Airlines Jumbo. The first officer reacted with a series of rapid alternating rudder movements that were far more aggressive than necessary. Those inputs generated enormous side forces on the vertical stabilizer until its attachments failed. The tail did not simply break off on its own. It was pushed beyond its design limits by the way the controls were being used. Investigators then asked a deeper question. Why would an experienced airline pilot make such large control inputs in response to moderate wake? The answer led back to training. American Airlines had been using an advanced maneuvering program that emphasized strong rudder use in simulated upsets and showed exaggerated wake effects in the simulator. Pilots came away with the impression that they needed to be very active with their feet to counter rolls and yaws, especially behind heavy jets. The subtle behavior of the Airbus rudder system, with light pedal forces at higher speeds, made it even easier to apply more input than intended. In the end, the official finding was that the probable cause of the crash was the first officer's unnecessary and excessive rudder pedal inputs, which created loads on the vertical stabilizer, beyond its ultimate strength. Contributing factors included the sensitivity of the A300 rudder system and elements of the airline's training program that unintentionally encouraged overuse of the rudder. On July 25, 2000, Paris Charles de Gaulle was in full summer rush when a white arrow of metal taxied out to the runway. This was Air France Flight 4590, the Concorde, getting ready for a special charter from Paris to New York. On board were mostly German tourists, heading across the Atlantic to join a cruise. For many of them, this was a once-in-a-lifetime dream. Fly the supersonic Concorde to America, then sail on. In the cabin, people took photos of the narrow windows and the sleek wing outside, proud to be on a legend. The airplane lined up on what was then runway 26 right. Another airliner, a large American-built jet, had taken off shortly before and left behind something that no one in the tower or cockpit could see, a thin metal strip lying on the runway surface. When the Concorde accelerated through takeoff speed, one of its left main tires hit that strip. In an instant, the tire exploded. Heavy chunks of rubber were thrown up into the underside of the wing with enormous force. One of those pieces of rubber slammed into the bottom of a fuel tank. The impact ruptured the tank and sent a jet of fuel pouring out. Almost immediately, that fuel found an ignition source. Flames erupted along the left side of the airplane just as it was reaching the point on the runway where the crew could no longer safely stop. Inside the cockpit, engine instruments started to show problems on the left side. The Concorde was now committed to fly, on fire, with failing thrust. The jet lifted off, but it was already badly hurt. Video and photos from the ground show a plume of fire streaming from the left wing as the airplane climbs away. The engine on the outer left side began to lose power. Then another engine on that wing also degraded. With so much thrust gone on one side, the Concorde struggled to gain speed and altitude. The nose was high, the wings were working hard just to keep the airplane in the air, and the fire continued to burn. Air traffic control suggested a turn toward a nearby airport at Le Bourget, but the crew had very little room to work with. The burning airplane began to drift left of its intended path, over the suburb of Gonesse. Witnesses on the ground saw flames trailing from the aircraft as it flew low and slow over fields and roads on the edge of town. The Concorde never fully cleaned up after takeoff, and never reached a safe climb. Its speed decayed toward stall, the bank increased, and the nose finally dropped. Seconds later, the supersonic icon came down in the worst possible place. The Concorde slammed into a small hotel and nearby buildings in Gonesse, just beyond the edge of the airport area. The impact and fireball destroyed the hotel, killed 4 people on the ground and everyone on board, 100 passengers and 9 crew members. Firefighters arriving at the scene were met with a wall of burning fuel, twisted white metal, and almost nothing left that looked like the famous sleek machine people knew from posters and TV. The investigation eventually traced the chain back to that strip of metal lying on the runway, dropped by another aircraft, and to the way Concorde's fuel tanks and tires had been designed. Changes were made to add protective liners and improve the tires, and the supersonic fleet did return to service for a short time. But the spell was broken. The crash of Flight 4590 showed that even the most glamorous airplane of its era could be brought down in minutes by a hidden piece of metal. A burst tire, a hole in a wing, and a fire that started just a few hundred meters after the takeoff roll began. For the people of Gonesse, it was not a distant symbol of speed, but a fully fueled airliner falling into their town. Cities are not meant to be crash sites. Streets, apartments, and quiet suburbs were never designed to carry the weight of a falling airliner. Yet in these stories they did. One broken approach, one missed clearance, one wrong control input, and the boundary between the sky and the city disappeared in a few seconds. Today, every one of these disasters lives on in procedures, training, and hard rules that keep modern airliners well away from the mistakes you have just seen. Separation standards, approach paths, cockpit discipline, and urban planning all carry the scars of these crashes, even if most travelers never notice. If this journey through the darker side of aviation history helped you understand what changed and why, I would be grateful if you could support the channel by subscribing and liking the video. It helps these stories reach more people, and it lets me keep telling them slowly and carefully for you.